Part 94. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 945. Actually, I'm really curious about how you got Fugui to that point. His ability is very disappointing, even for me. Lu Menjiao stood by the battlements, the sea breeze blew over her face, raising strands of black hair. At this moment, she was like a ripe peach, with an indescribable flavor and tenderness. She was extremely beautiful, otherwise Su Yuhang would not have might get stuck on her. Su Yuhang smiled. He didn't seem to want to mention that incident, but he didn't mind talking about it at this time, because there were not many people of that generation left. This woman has no one else qualified to tell her story. He saw far away, but ignored his feet. Just like the blind spot when driving, the taller the truck, the larger the blind spot. If you don't pay attention, something will happen. Su Yuhang did this a metaphor. Actually, there is one thing you didn't say. Lu Menjiao stroked her hair gently, with a smile on her lips, that is, Fugui treats you as a friend. It is a very pleasant thing to prick the softness in a person's heart and prick the guilt in a person's heart. Lu Menjiao felt this way at this time. The relationship between her and him is like opposition, but in another sense it is a kind of symbiosis, but they both have a deep sense of boundaries. Friend, Su Yuhang's eyes suddenly narrowed. Lu Menjiao looked at Su Yuhang at this time, his eyes were a little dazed. It had been many years since he had seen him like this. It was a pity that this feeling was only fleeting for Su Yuhang. Soon, he recovered again. His own ordinariness restored his cynicism. Unfortunately, there are no ifs. I don't know what choice Fugui would make if I were in a different position. Therefore, the safest way is to keep the power of making choices in my own hands. Take a long breath. Su Yuhang pointed to the sea in front of him. His Royal Highness, you have been down there for a long time. Go and meet him. No matter what, we can't let him send a message. Lu Menjiao took the lead and walked into the sea. The sea water quickly submerged her knees. At this time, she showed a kind of beautiful and touching beauty. Suddenly I don't want to go down to stop him. I want to paint a picture for you here. Su Yuhang took off his backpack. Inside, there were drawing paper and paint. Su Yuhang, I don't want to die. Lu Menjiao turned around, with the setting sun behind her like a foil. She looked at Su Yuhang seriously and solemnly. I don't want to die. Can't you let me become a young man? Su Yuhang shrugged. Sometimes I see our sons always like to play tricks to hurt each other. I'm really envious. Throwing away the brush, the paper, and the backpack, Su Yuhang staggered into the tide with his hands in his trouser pockets. The afterglow of the setting sun shone freely here. Su Yuhang turned around and saw the things he had left behind on the beach. In fact, he knew in his heart that what he had left behind was far more than these. A man and a woman were slowly submerged by the sea water, with an unimaginable calmness. Perhaps, in a certain sense, the eldest son Fusu is a character full of tragedy. In that so-called history, he was sentenced to death by his brother Jiao, who had usurped the throne. Even though he had 300,000 of the most elite frontier troops of the Qin dynasty by his side at that time, he still chose to commit suicide. Many years later, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang used the pretext of the Great Qin uprising to commit suicide. The name of Prince Fusu is enough to show how popular he was at that time. But in the real present, after 2,000 years of sealing, once you wake up from the dream, the empire dissipates. Everything in the past is already a thing of the past, including the terracotta warriors and horses. All the back ups left by the father are gone. He, not even Subai and the others, couldn't solve it. This is a kind of loneliness that has been abandoned by the whole world and the whole time, and it is also a kind of despair that goes deep into the bone marrow. And now, this mirror. He was also tampered with. It is equivalent to blocking his last remaining road. Fusu slumped on the ground holding the mirror. He was a member of the royal family. He was the real second generation. Therefore, even in front of Qin Yang, he had to control his identity and posture. He did not allow himself to be treated as a piece of cake by others. A bereaved dog. But now, in this silent space, it seems that I can express the emotions that I want and need to express most. In the distance, the boat is still floating, but it doesn't dare to get too close. You can still vaguely hear the chants of 3 or 5 bottles of water. I can only use 2 punches, and I know how to do martial arts boxing. Feeling desperate and helpless, but unable to do anything, Fusu had a smile on his lips. He was laughing at himself. He took the opportunity to break the seal from the great Buddha, and he still had the sense of urgency that time waits for no one. He also once doubted and thought about why the darkness would sit back and watch him walk back and forth in this world. Now, he got it. This is the most ruthless ridicule of the darkness to himself. He is like his doll. Watching himself running around, what he faces is nothing more than one desperate ending after another, and the darkness can learn from his decadence. Get that pleasure? Pleasure. Was it what the Western false emperor named Alexander taught him? Fusu knew clearly that his father's biggest regret in his life was that he did not get the opportunity to truly confront the false emperor in the West to see who was more powerful, his Macedonian phalanx or the mighty Great Qin tigers. In fact, Fusu didn't know that in the millennium after him, an emperor of the northern Song dynasty was captured by foreigners. He watched his wife and daughter being exchanged and played with by the foreigners. He wore a costume and stepped on the red-hot iron. Dancing on the board entertained the aliens. If Fusu knew about it, he would probably have a feeling of sympathy for each other. After all, if we put aside the appearance and look at the essence, he and that person are actually similar. Tap-ta. What surprised Fusu was that an outsider actually walked in at this time. Fusu raised his head and looked in the direction he came from. A man and a woman came over. They looked like a couple on an outing, with a smile on their faces. "Your Highness, the eldest young master?" The man asked with his head tilted slightly, then took out a cigarette from his pocket and slowly lit it. Lu Menjiao wanted to remind Su Yuhang that this gesture was ugly, just like a gangster trying to waste his breakfast money at the breakfast stall in front of the school. However, Lu Menjiao said nothing in the end. She also looked at this prince with a little curiosity. Ha! Fusu looked at the 2 people in front of him, 2 projections. "How dare you act so arrogantly in front of me?" That's wrong, Su Yuhang blew out a smoke ring. "It is precisely because we are 2 projections that we have nothing to fear." Lu Menjiao spread out one hand and pinched with his fingers. In an instant, Fusu felt that the mirror he was holding on was shaking slightly. Fusu was stunned for a moment, and then he realized. It's you who changed this mirror." Lu Menjiao nodded slightly. "I originally wanted to use this mirror as my home, but the inside is really too boring. Of course, there are some other things, but they are not interesting," Su Yuhang added. "To act as a helper to a tiger, you have no sense of shame, and you forget your ancestral lineage." Fusu was so angry that he lost all self-respect and restraint. In fact, this mirror and other decorations are of extremely important significance to Fusu, his father and the entire Great Qin Empire, but it seems that the decorations in other places are of great significance to Fusu. It was also changed by these 2 people. From a biological point of view, we are all monkeys in the beginning. Where do we come from so much righteousness? Are you right? Su Yuhang didn't mind how angry Fusu was at this moment, and he found it very interesting that he could even make such a well-educated prince lose his composure in front of him. "What are you going to do to Gu?" Fusu didn't believe that the other party was just using 2 projections to see how ugly he was. "It's nothing. I'll find you a place to stay for free." Su Yuhang clapped his hands, threw the cigarette butt at his feet, stepped on it, and then said to the woman next to him, "Daughter-in-law, let's get it done. Now that it's over, I'm going back, I have to urge that guy to move as soon as possible. Lu Menjiao opened his hands, and the lone boat instantly collapsed, and the dead souls on the lone boat were completely extinguished at this time. Then, the water surface began to float, turning into a series of cage-like structures. Blockade. Su Yuhang seemed to want to cooperate with Lu Menjiao, so he shouted deliberately. Please let me sleep for another 2,000 years. After everything was arranged, the sky-filled water curtain locked up the already somewhat frustrated eldest son. Lu Menjiao turned around and looked at Su Yuhang, saying, with that voice, it would be a pity not to play the eunuch. Going back now, Su Yuhang asked. Otherwise, you still want to see your son? Lu Menjiao asked. He's our son. Remember, I asked you for the eggs back then. Su Yuhang corrected him seriously, besides, he won't survive today. So confident, Lu Menjiao said with a smile, are you so unsure of your own son? What do you mean? Are you sure that he won't become the second Su Yuhang? His. Su Yuhang frowned as if he was in a dilemma. Hey, tell me, should I be happy that the tiger father has no sons, or should I be worried about this? No matter what, it's better for the white-haired man to send the black-haired man to you as soon as possible. He has lost his value and is basically out of control. If he can really get together with your goddaughter. Does it look like you and me back then? SHH, your dad is gone. Subai looked at the scene in front of him, and his heart was completely filled with shock. He knew that he couldn't hold on for long, so he eagerly hoped to encounter some turning points. This could very well be my turning point. After all, what happened to him now was entirely caused by Su Fuegui. The bald middle-aged man above continued. Shush, your dad is gone, shush shush shush, little ancestor, pee quickly. Subai. This chapter should be read and appreciated. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 946. After leaving these nonsensical words, Su Fuegui smiled again, as if he was teasing a friend's child, with a kind of kindness similar to that of an elder towards a younger generation. He can see himself. At that moment, Subai once remembered the first time he came across Su Yuhang's tombstone when he went to Huanquan. Su Yuhang, who left the tombstone here, seemed to have sensed something, and he lifted it casually, sending him flying out. But Subai knew clearly that at that time, Su Yuhang probably didn't know that it would be him standing in front of his tombstone more than 20 years later. But Su Fuegui was able to do this, but he was just like this, but for some reason, he was tricked by Su Yuhang into lying in the place of enlightenment for 20 years, and then when he handed over the guardianship to him. After taking the position of the deceased, he directly dissipated with the ashes of his deceased wife and no longer existed in this world. At one time, Subai also thought that Su Fuegui was a loser. He failed in the competition with Su Yuhang and ended up in this situation. But later, from Su Fuegui's attitude towards him and what he discovered after Su Fuegui's death, some of his things proved that his relationship with Su Yuhang was not that simple. But now, this joke, it's really not funny. Look, the starry sky in Abi Hell is so beautiful. Su Fuegui pointed to the sky, and then looked up himself. Then, the picture began to blur slowly. Also blurred was Subai at this moment, because he was now kneeling on the ground, his flesh and blood mangled. Under the endless pressure and confinement of the armored man, his body has been almost squeezed dry, and his body has begun to twist. Maybe after a few breaths, his body will turn into a puddle of flesh, and then drifting away in the wind. Just like how Su Fuegui died, clean and crisp, without leaving any trace. But Su Fuegui's last words made Subai suddenly think of something. After swallowing the eel and seeing the memory of Alyssa, ancient female corpse, Subai had discussed with Buddha specifically about himself in the picture. The environment of lying in a coffin. Sudbai specifically described the starry sky there to Lord Buddha, and even carved it with his fingernails on the coffee table. Lord Buddha said that it was the Abi hell. At that time, Sudbai, who thought he could not find any other clues, deliberately remembered the formation of stars in the sky above his head. It was different from any other constellation, with a simple yet mysterious connotation. And now, when this star map appeared in Sudbai's mind again, Sudbai suddenly realized that this map was a bit familiar. Suddenly, he thought of the bronze box, and then he thought of the armor that was being whipped at this moment. 3 bronze chains of the human body. Are these mysterious bronzes related to Abi Hell? Su Yuhang, Su Fuegui, and the Great Mage should have been similar to their relationship with Fatty Monk. What did they find in Abi Hell? It's just that there is no time left for Sudbai to think at this time, because he doesn't have much time anymore. All the strength in his body has been drained, and he seems to have. There is no way to recover. Dead. He's going to die. Ha 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 ha. He's going to die. The armored man's heart was being filled with a kind of ecstasy. His joy came inexplicably, because Sudbai and him did not have any deep hatred, but the development of things seemed to have deviated from the original track long ago, just like the Serbian youth in 1914. Just like the shot fired that finally triggered the First World War, many times, the final development of things is not constrained by expectations. The armored man almost superstitiously believed that Sudbai was his nemesis, because there were too many factors that he couldn't understand, making him extremely sensitive, or neurotic. Killing Sudbai had a higher meaning for him than revenge against Su Fuegui. Right now, this guy's body has been drained by himself, and his fire of life is about to be extinguished. The armored man looked at Sudbai in front of him, whose body had begun to twist and become withered and yellow, and he breathed a sigh of relief. But suddenly, he saw that the flesh and blood on Sudbai's cracked skin seemed to be slowly flowing again. This is a kind of artificially controlled flow. The blood and muscles are slowly changing, forming a pattern similar to a tattoo. Your struggle is useless, the armored man said solemnly. He was very excited and didn't even take it seriously, because Sudbai had no strength anymore and only the little bit of vitality left in his flesh and blood was actually Sudbai's fault. The last thing that can be mobilized and changed. Go to hell, it's over. The armored man was waiting for the end of a tenacious zombie's life dissipating in front of him, but at this moment, Sudbai's body, or more specifically, the pattern on Sudbai's skin actually bloomed with a ray of green light. No, this light was not coming from him. He had no power anymore. The armored man raised his head subconsciously. He saw that the bronze chains around him also glowed at this time, and the light on Sudbai's body was caused by these chains. The radiant projection is produced. An inexplicable sense of crisis that shook his soul came. The armored man almost roared. Go to hell. But at this moment, 3 virtual bronze chains directly penetrated the body of the armored man. Naturally, they also penetrated the isolation restriction imposed by the armored man on Sudbai, and directly entered Sudbai's body. And after entering Sudbai's body, these bronze chains began to gradually solidify, like 3 huge green chopsticks piercing Sudbai's body at the same time. This description is a bit bloody and cruel, but you must know that Sudbai is already after being squeezed dry to the point where only this piece of flesh is left. You can feel relieved. It's already as bad as the bottom line. If it gets worse, how much worse can it get? The next moment, the armored man was surprised to find that Sudbai's aura was picking up. Yes, it was actually picking up. How is this going? Having been sealed for 2,000 years and in a state of hibernation for most of the time, the armored man's mind was actually still the same age as before. Coupled with his severe neurosis, he completely lost his ability at this time. After a while, the armor man discovered that the key to the problem was that the bronze chains were constantly delivering a special energy to Sudbai. This was the power of the bronze chains, a power similar to the origin of the magic weapon. For more than 2,000 years, the bronze chain has been nourished by the water veins of Sanjiang. How terrifying is the aura it has accumulated. Subai felt so comfortable that he almost cried out. A man who was almost dying of thirst was suddenly given a large vat of water, and his body's instinctive reaction even exceeded the speed of his consciousness. Subai was desperately absorbing it, desperately trying to eat the food that was offered to him. He was crazy and couldn't wait to eat it. The armored man began to attack Subai. Even if he gave Subai a chance to breathe, he would not allow Subai to continue to get replenishment from the bronze chains. However, these three bronze chains seemed to isolate this space, completely killing Subai. The ground was sealed inside, and no matter how hard the armored man struck, it was of no avail. The chains that were meant to trap him were naturally more targeted when facing his attacks. This made the armored man almost crazy. His eyes had long been filled with anger and panic. He didn't know why this happened, but he knew clearly that he should never let this continue. He kept bombarding the space in front of him like crazy, tirelessly, and the entire space kept echoing with huge roars. At least, for this small space, it really seemed like the end of the world. But the three bronze chains still stood, and Subai's aura began to change from a puddle of mud to the aura of an ordinary person, and gradually began to rise to the level of a low-level audience, and this improvement continued. Buddha, who was trapped in the distance, saw the scene in front of him and opened his mouth. He was a little lucky for the fat man that he was still unconscious at this time, otherwise he would probably be heartbroken after seeing this scene. Although this kind of mentality and thinking is wrong, Buddha still can't figure out why we have reached this situation and why things can actually take such a huge turn for the better. This can no longer be explained by luck. As for the monk, Buddha did not continue to pay attention, but he believed that the monk should also be paying attention to everything that was happening in front of him. Strength. Origin. Strength. What was just forced to be lost is now being slowly recovered, and like a filter, all the impurities and power attributes in the body have been removed. Now when it is absorbed again, everything can be done. The most perfect purity. Subai slowly opened his eyes. At this time, his strength had reached the level of a senior. He saw that the armored man in front of him was constantly bombarding the diaphragm in front of him to no avail. He was also mentally ill, and he could feel the other party was hysterical at this time, but Subai had a smile on his lips. If you want to kill me, come on. With the gradual recovery of strength and origin, Subai's brain began to regain clarity. One thing he could think of was that his opportunity this time seemed to be related to the confrontation between Su Fuegui and his father, Su Yuhang. Su Fuegui, who followed Su Yuhang and the mage at the beginning, probably didn't know that he would be tricked so miserably by his best friend in the future. He was just teasing him, but what happened next? When I first entered the place of enlightenment with a group of senior people. Why did Su Fuegui, who had been lying in the coffin for 20 years, insist on staying at the last moment? I learned his third transformation of the ancient zombie, and I kept absorbing the corpse energy. Under Su Fuegui's guidance, I finally took over Su Fuegui's position and became the new guardian of the place of enlightenment. All of this seems too deliberate. Just like the so-called vow of eternal love, there is no need to deliberately pursue its effectiveness. At least when a couple is passionately in love, both parties are sincere when they say this. In other words, Su Fuegui may have seen the shadow of Subai, the child of his best friend, in the female body lying in the coffin below, so he teased her for a while, but then Su Fuegui, who was lying in the coffin, changed the former. His purely unintentional act was taken advantage of. Only. So ironic. It seems that his father has finished using him and wants him to die. And his enemy. But he wants to survive for revenge. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 947. The armored man's madness continues. He is tireless, does not know the end, and is even a little ignorant. In fact, even if Sudbai's strength recovers, he will not be his opponent, but he has completely lost his bearings in the face of this change, and his whole person has fallen into a kind of persecution paranoia. There are many things in the dark world that no one can explain clearly, and no one can distinguish clearly, but once you fall into it, it is like a person walking into a swamp. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. Sudbai, who was blessed by 3 bronze chains, looked at the armored man in front of him so crazy and urgent at first. He felt a little gloating in his heart, but after a long time, the smile at the corner of Sudbai's mouth disappeared. He suddenly felt, this armored man is very similar to himself. Sudbai didn't know why Xiaolong sealed him here, but with Xiaolong's temper, tens of thousands of tigers and tigers under his command were able to kill each other just to create 500 evil stars, and his emperor's character was absolutely impossible to treat the situation in front of him. This armored man has no mercy at all. First seal it layer by layer, and then put on a piece of armor, maybe it is just a chess piece. Being a chess piece and a puppet, controlled by others and unable to control himself, Sudbai has also experienced this situation. Sudbai still remembers that after learning the truth, he drove a car alone on the highway and stepped on the accelerator to the bottom. When the little guy was kidnapped, the whole person fell into suppressed hysteria. Too much, really too much. But now, the armored man gave himself more feelings. However, feelings are just feelings after all, and Sudbai can't feel the slightest sympathy. After all, he was almost killed by the other party just now. Sudbai has always been very determined on how to deal with someone who wants to kill him. Buzz. A tremor came from Sudbai's body, and the foundation of the high-level audience was condensed again. This time, it was more solid and stable than before. When Sudbai advanced, he piled up everything he could use. In the end, he relied on gold to complete the last piece with his own body. Therefore, this foundation was inherently unstable and the materials used were too messy. But this time, it was completely done in one go. Just like before, it was a field paved with gravel, but this time it was a smooth cement floor. Sudbai slowly opened his arms. He wanted to continue to absorb energy from these 3 bronze chains, but for some reason, it seemed that the energy levels of these 3 bronze chains were saturated with his own. This was a bit like they are 2 completely different liquids. Although there is a huge gap in quantity, they can no longer dissolve with each other. On the contrary, Sudbai felt that after he raised his realm to a high-level audience again, the power in his body seemed to have a certain power to pour back the trend of bronze chains. Maybe it should be that after my strength returned to a high-level audience, my strength has changed qualitatively compared to before, so I can no longer draw what I need from the chain. But in this case, my current cultivation level is only the beginning of advanced audience level, and I still have not returned to the previous peak level. And at this moment, Sudbai found that the membrane in front of him was also beginning to crack. It was not that the brave bombardment of the armored men had an effect, but because the luster of the bronze chains was slowly fading away, and it was gradually unable to support the space. In this way, not only would Sudbai be completely exposed to the other party, but it would also be equivalent to giving freedom to the armored man in front of him. This is a difficult game to play. The difficulty of the game has not fundamentally changed because of Sudbai's escape. After all, if the opponent can almost kill him once, he can do it again. Click. The 3 bronze chains separated from Sudbai's body, seeming to have become much weaker, losing their previous demeanor of constantly beating the armored man. Snapped. The barrier between the armored man and Sudbai was completely broken at this time. The armored man roared, just like a lion that had been starved for several days in a cage when he saw a living person standing in front of him. He couldn't wait to see a living person standing in front of him. He rushed towards Subai. Subai's legs bent slightly and his center of gravity sank. Then, when the armored man rushed to him, Subai stretched out his arms. Subai wanted to use this method to throw the armored man away. After all, with his previous experience, Subai clearly knew the gap in pure strength between himself and his opponent, but when Subai's hands reached the armored man's body, Subai was shocked to find that the pressure he was under seemed to be greater than expected. A little smaller. Kneeling on one knee, without thinking too much, Subai threw his arms out, and exerted force on his waist at the same time. The armored figure was about to be thrown out by Subai like a sandbag. But although the armored man fell into a state of madness, his fighting instinct was still there. At this time, he reacted quickly and grabbed Subai's right arm with one hand while his body was in mid-air. Bang! 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 The two men grabbed each other and rolled continuously on the ground. Every impact seemed to bring a thunderous roar. After the power of the bronze chain was instilled into Subai's body, the space began to become fragile. When he got up, it seemed that it would be difficult to bear the blow of the strength of the two fighting against each other. Are you stronger than before? Or has the armored man become weaker? Subai didn't know, because his realm had not yet fully returned to its peak. Although the quantity had become smaller, the quality had undoubtedly improved. The armored man had to sacrifice himself first, and at the same time endured the bronze chains on his soul so many times. Naturally, he suffered a lot of injuries from the blow. At the same time, the armor was like a blood leech. If you are weak, he is strong. The weaker the person in the armor is, the more seals and restrictions the armor will impose on him. After all, from the initial confrontation to the present, the armored man has been in an absolutely unfair situation. Fortunately, Subai didn't have any mental disorder in this regard. After the two kicked each other away, Subai immediately got up again. The armored man over there also quickly stood up again, but his breath was obviously much disordered. At the same time, the red eyes in the helmet no longer had the brilliance they had before. You can't kill me, the armored man said, most of my power is sealed, so you can't kill me. You talk like you can kill me, Subai asked, is the turtle shell on your body getting heavier and heavier? The armored man was instantly shrouded in a layer of black mist, and then he rushed towards Subai again. This time, he tried his best. Subai's eyes narrowed, and he could feel that the other party's aura seemed to have increased sharply at this time. This was very unusual, because it meant that the other party had used all the energy that he could use in the sealed state this time. The power burst out in a short period of time, leaving no trace to resist the seal of the armor. This also means that after this wave of offensive, no matter whether he can kill himself or not, he will fall into the seal of the armor again. This means that he will have to sleep for another 2,000 years to kill himself. This guy is crazy, completely crazy. I have to say that at this time, Subai felt a sense of absurdity and powerlessness in his heart. This guy was really too similar to himself to a certain extent, even with this desperate and life or death mentality. Boom! The two collided again. Subai failed to stop the other party, and his body was knocked away. The next moment, the other party appeared in front of Subai again and punched him hard. Subai used his right arm to block. In this situation, the balance between the two sides, which was almost on the same starting line, once again became horribly unbalanced. The sudden increase in the opponent's strength and speed caused Subai to almost completely lose control of the battle situation during this period, and could only cope with it passively. Boom! Subai felt a tearing pain in his right arm. Then, the area under the wrist of his right arm was completely broken. The opponent's attack force had reached a point where his body could not resist and bear it. Go to hell, go to hell. The armored man's offensive wasn't over yet, and the terror he unleashed at this moment really seemed to be a bit like the shadow of his heyday. Boom! The armored man kicked down and hit Subai directly in the abdomen. Puff! Subai only felt that his chest was pierced in an instant, and the other party's foot actually penetrated his chest, and trampled himself hard on the ground. Go to hell! Go to hell! Go to hell! The hysterical roars echoed here endlessly. The kind of madness and the risk-taking at all costs are simply unimaginable. The armored man punched him several times in a row, and Subai showed a decisive look on his eyebrows. If the other party dared to risk his life, wouldn't he dare to do it himself? Click. At this moment, Subai opened it with one hand, and the area below his chest was directly separated from his upper body. Subai's head and one arm flew backwards and breathed out. The armored man let out a low roar, tore apart Subai's remaining body, and then began to search for Subai's upper torso. But then, the armored man was stunned for a moment, because he saw a chain coming down vertically again, piercing Subai. The upper torso was so mutilated that it could no longer be mutilated, and Subai seemed to be injected with life again. The lower body that had just collapsed actually started to regenerate at this time. This is not the regeneration of a vampire bloodline in the traditional sense, because the body regenerated this time is no different from the one at its peak, and it is definitely not a makeshift one. Subai's eyes began to glow with blood, and he twisted his neck slightly. How could this happen? How could this happen? The armored man's faith collapsed at this moment. Once he injured the opponent, he could recover quickly, so how could he still hit him? This duel. What hope is there? Is this my destiny? The black mist surrounding the armored man began to slowly dissipate, and at the same time his aura began to wane in a slippery slope. Obviously, after the explosion just now, he could no longer resist the seal on the armor. The black mist that originally trapped the monk, Fat Man, and Lord Buddha also dissipated at this time. Is this really an arranged fate? Buddha said with some regret. But at this moment, a hurried shout suddenly came from the monk who had been quiet just now. Dabai, you are the one who has been arranged, Gujan second rank. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 948. In the early 1990s, China was in a stage of rapid change. There were more and more new things, but the old things were still struggling. Things that were neither old nor new were still making a loud noise in the middle, whether it was the economy or the thoughts and culture are all in a state of rapid change and turmoil. At that time, KTV was still a very trendy thing, and the proportion of massage parlors actually doing massages and pedicures was much smaller than in later generations. At the end of this road is a large state-owned textile factory. According to previous habits, the workers basically regard the factory as their home and are proud of it. A worker represents a family and a large number of people, so they often work in large factories. There will always be a dense flow of people near the factory. Every time when they get off work or are about to get off work, many vendors will come to this road to set up stalls and do business. Many of them are regular employees of the factory who come out to make extra money. There were many places selling food and clothing, and at this time, the concept of city rectification was not as strict as in later generations. The police station was too lazy to take care of it, and the factory security department turned a blind eye. At a wonton stall, a young man wearing very fashionable clothes was sitting there and enjoying his meal. Even in later generations, his clothes would definitely not mean that he was out of date. Coupled with his good-looking appearance, he was sitting there, eating wontons at a small plastic table on the roadside. He always attracts the attention of the group of female workers returning home from get-off work. People in later generations often think that the changes of the times and the popularization and development of communication tools have made things that impact the daily ethics of society become widespread and serious. But in fact, this kind of thing is human nature. Otherwise, Why would Pan Will Jin Lian open that window? It's just a pity that the man seemed to be a pure foodie. There were 3 bowls of wontons in front of him, and he just ate them without paying any attention to the flirtatious glances nearby. A middle-aged man with a big belly came over, moved a small bench and sat down at the small table. He directly picked up a bowl of wontons in front of the man and started eating. "Order it yourself," the man complained dissatisfiedly. "I have a bad stomach and am afraid of being burned," the middle-aged man explained. "Who asked you to be a zombie? By the way, do zombies still need to eat? Aren't you full just by lying among the dead every day?" the man joked. He had just gotten off work at this time, and the night market had just opened its stalls, so people nearby not much, but no one heard such an outrageous conversation between the two. "Then why don't you make yourself a paper figurine to solve your physiological problems? You've been pestering Menjiu about what to do." The middle-aged man took a big sip of soup and seemed very satisfied. "Can it be the same? Man, what I pursue is feelings, and what I enjoy is the process of mountain climbing. It is a kind of spur and drive for myself. I have never really thought about what it would be like to climb to the top of the mountain one day to watch the sun rise. It feels like, maybe, it will be boring. To put it simply, it means starting with chaos and finally giving up. Once you play it, it will no longer feel fresh." The middle-aged man looked like he had been through it before. "Hey, my rich brother, I'm begging you, when I'm chatting with you, can you not make a concluding speech like you usually do in work meetings? That will make you chatter to death, okay? Telling you how beautiful, noble, and elegant Lu Menjiu is," Fugui paused and said, "I'm afraid you will hit me." "Who dares to beat you?" Su Yuhang shook his head. "If I can't beat you to death, I will be tricked to death by you." "No, if I plan to beat you today, would you have known about it 10 days ago and made preparations? This is too much of a disadvantage. It's not that exaggerated. Didn't I tell you before? I can't see the future of people who are close to me." Su Fugui took another mouthful of wontons, as if he was a little full, and said, "I had eaten at home when I came out. My sister-in-law's cooking is only because you can eat it every day." Su Yuhang sarcastically said, "Since I had dinner at your house last time, I vowed not to eat it a second time. In the past, conditions were harsh, and there was nowhere to eat. At that time, having enough food was very delicious, and she had no place to practice her crafts. How is it like you, who came from a high-level courtyard and has never eaten anything since you were a child? Is it bitter? Come on, don't do this with me. Let's remember the bitterness and sweetness. When you hold the meeting, tell the people below that we are not interested in this. I will settle the bill. How many steps can you take to eat?" "Can. There are only a few lively neighborhoods in this small city in this era." After walking for a long time, the surroundings became a little more desolate. Occasionally, you can see people riding bicycles passing by, and you can even see people passing by in groups of 3 or 5. The city did not yet have the concept of widespread cameras in later generations, so it was naturally difficult to achieve good security. But these problems do not exist for these 2 people. Su Yuhang took out his cigarettes, took one in his mouth, and handed another to Fugui. "Hey, it's a special treat. Say it like you can't smoke it. It's a different level." The 2 people nodded and swallowed the fog while walking, making their own contribution to global warming. "Tell me, you came to me as soon as you left the story world. What's the matter?" Fugui asked, shaking off the ashes of his cigarette. "Can't it be that I miss you?" Su Yuhang asked. "Okay, if I remember correctly, you entered the last story world with Lu Menjiu. It seems to be the story world of Mr. Zombie. Once the story world is over, why don't you continue to be friendly with her and consolidate the revolutionary friendship of life and death? Why did you come to me?" Su Fugui laughed as he spoke. "I'm not as charming as Lu Menjiu. Come on, let me tell you." Su Yuhang squatted down on the side of the road. He found a branch and started painting on the asphalt road. After a while, a simple painting appeared in front of him. Although the asphalt road will become soft in summer, it will become soft in the summer. It is almost impossible for ordinary people to paint on it. My painting skills have improved a lot, Su Fuegui sighed. He knew that his friend had deep attainments in calligraphy and painting. Look here, this is a place in the story world of Mr. Zombie. It can be regarded as a monster cave. There are many monsters living in it. Menu and I originally planned to break away from other listeners and go into the monster cave to try our luck, but just at this entrance, a whirlpool suddenly appeared, and then this guy came out. In Su Yuhang's paintings, there are two groups of people. One group is a man and a woman. Although there are only a few strokes, they are full of charm. It can be seen that they are Su Yuhang himself and Lu Menjiao, and the other group is from the whirlpool. The man walking out. This person's face can't be seen clearly, and even his clothes are blurry. I can only tell that he is a man, and he is not very old. Su Fuegui knew Su Yuhang's skills, so obviously the other person's image and clothes were blurred not because of Su Yuhang. Yuhang didn't draw well, but maybe Su Yuhang himself couldn't remember the other person's clothes and appearance clearly. There might be something wrong with the broadcast. A level that was originally set up was evacuated by the broadcast. Have you ever fought against each other? Su Fuegui asked. We fought briefly, and I was planning to trigger the thunder. That guy has very strong melee capabilities and is very difficult to deal with. Moreover, I feel like he is also a zombie, but unlike your zombie, you are an out-and-out zombie. Zombie, I can't tell you what it is, it feels a bit impure. Impure, Su Fuegui murmured and said, then it may be that the blood is impure. What will happen in the end? In the end, he suddenly disappeared. This guy's appearance and disappearance felt confusing, Su Yuhang said. Let me see, what kind of knowledge can I see? Su Fuegui shook his head helplessly, it's not like you don't know what I am. No matter how outsiders spread it, even the big guys occasionally look for me, but if I can really know 500 years in advance and 500 years in the future, why should I be a listener? I can just be a radio announcer. Can't you really tell? Su Yuhang said helplessly, although broadcasts sometimes have some problems and even some mistakes, this time I really don't feel like it is a mistake, but a special feeling. Menjiao feels the same as me. Okay, anyway, I can't see it. Since it has no beginning and no end and has no impact on the plot of your story world, then maybe some big boss is doing something to resist the broadcast and cause some mistakes in the broadcast. Or, you could simply think of him as your and Lu Menjiao's son who came to you to find a bride, ha ha ha. Su Fuegui couldn't help laughing as he spoke. The more you talk, the more nonsense you get. Su Yuhang was angry and funny, and then said, by the way, I recently met a scientist, who is quite interesting. Do you still believe in science? Su Fuegui was surprised, because the existence of radio is the biggest anti-science. It's not bad. We get along well with him, and he can also produce some interesting products for me. It shouldn't be of much use to you now, right? What about next? No one can tell what will happen in the future. By the way, Fuegui, can you see the day when Lu Menjiao and I get married? Su Yuhang suddenly asked. Su Fuegui shook his head, you and I are too close, I can't tell, but if you have a child in the future, I can be his godfather. The relationship is good. My son will ask you as his godfather to read the exam questions in advance before the exam. There is no need to panic for the high school entrance examination and the college entrance examination. Su Yuhang patted Su Fuegui on the shoulder, and his mood suddenly dropped. Fuegui, how many years can we live? I think I can live a long time, unexpectedly long at this point. Su Fuegui showed doubts on his face, I don't know if my feeling is right or wrong. What's the difference between right and wrong if you can live as long as you want? Just be content. But I think I can live for another 20 years. Do you believe it? Su Fuegui turned his head and looked at Su Yuhang seriously. I don't believe it myself. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 949. The night breeze is slightly cool and refreshing, but at the end of summer, it makes people feel very comfortable. After all, they have just experienced the baptism of scorching heat. At this time, most people are still willing to let the cold come more violent. A young man slowly walked up the mountain step by step. On his shoulder was a money turtle crawling there, as steady as a mountain. The closer you go to the top of the mountain, the fresher the surrounding air becomes. This freshness is not due to the altitude factor in the ordinary sense, but because the spiritual energy around you begins to become richer. The man could clearly feel that the sleeping turtle on his shoulder was starting to look a little more excited. Unfortunately, it had just gained spirituality and didn't know how to practice it yet. It only knew how to swallow it stupidly. After rolling into a round body, he continued to sleep. It seemed like such a silly approach. If he wanted to practice the Taoism, he would have to wait for who knows how long. Fortunately, the turtle lived longer. The man didn't put any effort into it, and it was no different from the pets kept by ordinary people. But as the saying goes, if a person can ascend to heaven with a chicken or a dog, anything that can always be with him will change a little as long as he is not hopelessly stupid. Just like this money turtle. He reached out and picked off a banana leaf. Ah! Stretching slightly, the man looked particularly lazy. His temperament at this time was quite like that of an ancient celebrity. Of course, in ancient times, appearance and temperament were also one of the thresholds for entering an official career, especially in those periods when the imperial examination was not perfected. If you wanted to be an official and meet your own progress requirements, you had to either let your mother, or when your father is sick, you will be filial to your parents by beating gongs and drums, or you will be waiting for a big shot to pass by and lay out your paws in advance. Even in the cold winter, you have to stand alone in light clothes, blowing a fan and coughing blood to be called a celebrity. However, the temperament of a man cannot be faked. Even for the audience, it is difficult to deliberately create a temperament that is not his own. After all, these things are deeply rooted in the bone marrow. When the man reached the top of the mountain, another middle-aged man appeared, and the images of the two men instantly formed a sharp contrast. Because the other party was shirtless and holding a shovel in his hand, he kept shoveling back and forth. The soil he shoveled out was filled back in by him, over and over again, as if he was not tired or bored at all. The young man squatted down next to him and just watched the middle-aged man in front of him doing such a mindless thing. After watching for half an hour, the young man became a little tired. He couldn't bear it anymore and said, "I said, Lao Yan, have you been like this for 2 days? I regret not buying some seeds when we were at the bottom of the mountain. You have plowed the land on this mountain top. It would be a pity not to plant something." Yan Huiyong was stunned for a moment and frowned, as if he just realized that he had been shoveling for so long, but he felt that only a while had passed. He turned his head and looked at Piaolu sitting over there, and then looked intently. The tortoise who landed on Piaolu's shoulder smiled and said, "Your pet fetishes are getting weirder and weirder." "Nonsense, how well I raised my Pixio last time and how much effort I put into it, but it was sucked to death by that guy. Now I see it, it's quite worry-free to raise a little turtle. By the way, you invited me to the boundary of Guangxi to tell me what kind of secret place you discovered. I have been looking for you for so long before I could sense your breath nearby. I can understand why you let me go. No one is in a hurry. I have to be busy, right? But you are actually plowing here. The radio station is about to move, and we have also been included in the cleanup list. However, the world will not be destroyed. Ordinary people can live ordinary lives as usual. Listeners who don't understand may think that the end of the world is coming and prepare in advance. There's a food shortage. Hai Yan Huiyong sighed heavily, then subconsciously threw the shovel away, then felt something was wrong and immediately picked it up again. Magical weapon? Piao Lu asked a little strangely. A magic weapon produced by the Nanning state-owned agricultural tool factory. Yan Huiyong showed the sign of the shovel to Piao Lu. Do you want to get in the car? Hey, why are you so crazy? Are you going to go to that secret realm? Piao Lu was obviously helpless, and of course, a little impatient. Wait a little longer, we have to see something more. Yan Huiyong shook his head, then waved his palm, and a light blue light bloomed in his eyes. Then, the scene from that day appeared again, and he saw a middle-aged man with a bloated body and a bald head slowly walk down the mountain from here holding an urn. Yan Huiyong held a shovel in his hand and followed suit. This scene was just a memory of the vegetation that had been nourished by wealth, so it was not real. It was a bit like watching a videotape. Pilu was a little strange, seeing Yan Huiyong walking slowly and stupidly past him, and then slowly leaning towards him on the way down the mountain. What the hell? Pilu's fingertips swept across his eyebrows, and there was a flash of light in his eyes, but he couldn't see anything. At this time, he was too embarrassed to disturb Yan Huiyong's progress. Destroying people's feelings is like killing parents. This is what the audience thinks. There are unwritten rules, and Piao Lu is not so ignorant. But driven by curiosity, Piao Lu continued to follow Yan Huiyong. The road in the mountains is not easy to walk. This is not because Yan Huiyong walked slowly, but because the rich man walked very slowly back then. A mountain road, the same late at night, the dark night, looks very desolate. Yan Huiyong walked slowly and followed slowly, as if just to revisit the last scene in the life of the Mr. Money Spreader. Gradually, we went down the mountain and slowly entered the county town. Yan Huiyong looked at Fugui, who looked a bit senile. The vitality that had been leaking out along the way had changed his appearance. In fact, he might have been dead a long time ago. Even if he was not dead before, it would be a shame to have leaked so much vitality now. It's impossible to survive. The origin is not cabbage on the roadside, it is not that easy to replenish, and it is unimaginably expensive. Fugui's body began to become more and more transparent, and his pace began to become slower and slower. Slowly, he began to talk to himself. In fact, he didn't stop from the time he dug up his deceased wife's grave with a shovel and took out the urn. He was talking to himself, but the emotions in his words began to become deeper and deeper, like a jar of wine, which was rapidly passing through the precipitation of time. Yan Huiyong took a deep breath. In fact, it was nothing to see, but for some reason, he seemed to be fascinated by it. Piao Lu behind him teased the money turtle from time to time. He was bored. He didn't know how crazy Yan Huiyong was. In fact, if it wasn't for the secret realm and needed to get some information from Yan Huiyong, he would have slapped his butt. Leave. Lao Fugui looked around, as if he was holding his wife's hand while shopping. In the end, Lao Fugui seemed to realize something. A child riding a bicycle passed right through him. The old rich man sat on the ground slumped. Yan Huiyong stood next to Lao Fugui, listening to Lao Fugui's last murmurs, as if he himself had not expected that he was actually dead before he knew it. Yan Huiyong squatted down next to him. He wanted to take a closer look at the guardian who was said to have survived for many years in the place of enlightenment and watched generations of big bosses achieve enlightenment. There was sadness on Lao Fugui's face, 30% of it was accident and 70% of relief. This seemed to be his own choice, more like the final appeal he had been waiting for a long time. But as a listener, who is willing to die? At least Yan Huiyong doesn't take life and death lightly, otherwise he would have died long ago. How happy would it be to die? At this time, the urn opened by itself, and the ashes began to scatter. Little stars began to shine out of Lao Fugui's body, and at the same time, his own body began to become more and more transparent. Is this the end? Yan Huiyang is a very calm person. Before he became an audience member, he was a gangster. He was very loyal and had been in trouble several times. Feng Xiaogong's old power a few years ago seemed to be a microcosm of his previous years. Even after becoming a listener, some of his habits did not change. It was the first time he met Subai. At that time, he thought Subai, a junior, was quite interesting and even gave him a thumbs up. Now, it is a bit sad to see this person who was considered one of the giants at the beginning reach the last step of his life. In fact, Yan Huiyang was also thinking, who killed Fugui? It stands to reason that for such a giant to exist, in this real world, except for radio, nothing can kill him, but he died, and in such a bizarre way. In Yan Huiyang's view, it was Su Fugui's own heart that died. When he dug up his late wife's grave, he was already leaking the source of his vitality. It was because he was tired from deep down and no longer wanted to live. There is no greater sorrow than death, and it has been perfectly interpreted by Su Fugui. Even Su Fugui himself seemed to be a little unprepared. Maybe it was because after death, everything ended too quickly. Maybe he even obeyed my own intention, but I am actually not quite ready yet. After all, people have two sides, rationality and sensibility. Yan Huiyang has seen many people die in various ways of death, but he has never seen such an example where the heart dies first and then the person dies. Today, it was an eye-opener for him. But at this moment, Yan Huiyang, who was just waiting for all this to end and then do whatever he had to do, suddenly saw Su Fugui, whose body was almost completely transparent, suddenly turned his head and looked at him. Su Fugui's eyes, Su Fugui his expression and Su Fugui's tone at this time seemed to tell Yan Huiyang that he was talking to himself and that he could see him. You said, can a person still live without his heart? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 950. Suddenly, Yan Huiyang felt a chill on his back. If the old rich man throwing the shovel to him on the hilltop could be interpreted as a far-sighted little cleverness, then behind the scene now it contains a frightening undercurrent. Can a person live without intention? This is a story from the Romance of the Gods. Daji tricked King Zhou and asked Bigan to dig out his heart. Zhangxia asked Bigan to drink the talisman water in advance, and then asked Bigan to dig out his heart and then ran out of the palace to find a water spinach cellar. She asks, can a person live without a heart? If the person answers that he can live, he can live. If the person answers that he cannot live, he can only die. The interpretation in the TV series is richer. Daji transformed into a woman selling water spinach and replied, of course you will die if you don't care. Then Bigan spit out a mouthful of blood and died directly. Of course, Yan Huiyang is no stranger to this story and this metaphor. In fact, the truth contained in this story is nothing more than the word faith. It stands to reason that people will definitely die after their hearts are dug out, but compared to Qian could still run out of the palace. The talisman water Zhangxia gave him was equivalent to a belief, making him think that he could live. But in the end, the answer given by the woman selling water spinach was equivalent to shattering his belief and he died. Yan Huiyang had heard some similar stories. For example, in the Qing dynasty, a man committed a crime. It was a capital crime and he had to be executed. His uncle was the executioner. He went to ask his uncle if there was any way to keep him alive. His uncle just of course, an executioner had no energy to save him, so he could only comfort him by telling him that when he raised the sword, he could survive by closing his eyes and running forward. When asked to behead him later, the uncle raised his knife and chopped off his nephew's head, and the incident was over. Who knew that a few years later, my uncle suddenly received a letter, written by his nephew, thanking his uncle for telling him how to survive. Now he has changed his mind and worked hard for several years, and now has his own small family business, and even married a wife and gave birth to a child. A child invites his uncle to his house for tea and dinner. Because my nephew is a criminal, I have always kept his name anonymous. The uncle overcame his inner fear and came to the door. Sure enough, he saw his nephew. The nephew thanked his uncle in person for giving him the way to survive. The uncle also saw his nephew's child lying on the bed, a 1-year-old child, and his wife was cook. The uncle could only tell the truth, saying that he had actually cut off his head, and that method was what he said to comfort him. After hearing this, the nephew's expression changed greatly, and then he understood, and his body immediately turned into a pool of black blood. The child on the bed turned into a pool of blood, and the nephew's wife turned into a black cat. Black Cat sighed, "You shouldn't tell him, he always thought he was still alive." Yan Huiyong felt that Lao Fugui should be in that state at this time. His heart died, so he died. In fact, it was not other people who killed him, but himself. But at this time, he seemed to have joined this game inexplicably. He didn't know why the old rich man came to find him. Could it be that there was a destiny in the dark? But now I am like the water spinach woman and the executioner uncle when Bigan dug out the heart. The life and death of Lao Fugui seemed to lie in his own answer. He is already dead. All of this was just a scene from more than half a year ago. Everything is already decided. Yan Huiyong was a little confused and frightened. Could it be said that as long as he answers I can live at this time, a person who has been dead for more than half a year can come back to life? Piao Tower in the distance was already feeling impatient, but suddenly he saw Yan Huiyong squatting there with a look of horror on his face. He was also shocked at the moment. In the end, what happened? How could he actually make such a powerful person at the pinnacle of advanced audience become so miserable? Under the Lishan giant Buddha, in the Sumeru space, the monk who had been silent just now shouted directly to Subai after the seal was released. At this time, Bhutan naturally did not think about the monk's previous sitting without disturbing matter. In fact, if that matter happened to him, he would probably make the same choice. Even Dabai, he might also make the same choice. Choose, of course, except when Bimax gets sick, it's hard to say what he will choose at that time. The fat man just woke up from his coma. Apparently he didn't understand what happened. He just felt that the black mist that had been suppressing his body and soul had disappeared. Then he saw several bronze chains floating in the air on Subai's body, and muttered in a low voice, "Dabai, this is a good boss. I remember that there was a villain boss in Spider-Man who looked very similar to yours." The man in armor had completely lost his life at this time. Only the suit of armor was still floating, like an ornament hanging there. The terrifying existence that had just erupted was really like a dream. When you wake up from the dream, he disappeared. Perhaps, he was the most aggrieved, because even after being sealed for 2,000 years, even after he woke up, he still could not use all his power. In the end, the sudden change of things made him return again with deep unwillingness and fear. Sealed. Subai still felt sympathy for each other, but he definitely didn't feel pity. Moreover, at such a tense moment just now, Subai didn't have the onlooker's mind like Buddha to think that the monk actually had a backup plan that he didn't have, so at this time after hearing the monk's reminder to him, Subai turned his head and looked at the monk and asked, "Monk, what do you mean?" The monk frowned, as if he was in great trouble. This kind of concern cannot be faked, just like you have a good brother, and you have a good relationship with him, but if you give him your life in exchange for him, you probably wouldn't choose to agree to survive, but the feelings and care for each other are still real. Have you felt the side effects of the second level of ancient zombies? The monk asked. Side effect? Subai seemed to understand, then felt it, and said, It seems that the side effects are not obvious this time. After saying that, Subai suddenly fell silent. He finally understood what the monk meant. For a time, the entire atmosphere fell into solemnity. Buddha seemed to slowly realize something at this time, and then took a deep breath, thinking in his heart, how could this monk think of this level? The fat man was still a little dazed, as if he still didn't know what was happening. He only knew that Subai was floating in the sky with a strong aura, and the guy who was so crazy that he could see the sun and the earth had turned into a turtle shell again. What's going on? Fatty's voice became a little hoarse, and he asked with difficulty as he got up from the ground. Subai lowered his head and looked at the bronze chain that was still inserted into his body to constantly replenish his strength. In fact, there is no love for no reason in this world, and there is no hate for no reason. Subai understood this very early. But, I don't know when I walked into the urn again. Angry. It's hard to be angry anymore. Anger. I can't even get angry anymore. It seems that not long after he got rid of the control of his cheap parents, he unknowingly walked into another situation. But he had no choice at all. Just now, if he had not accepted the energy infusion and blessing of these 3 bronze chains, he might have been wiped out under the suppression of the armored man. But at the moment, he is like Tang Monk. He has been washed and has set up a steamer. Even the fire below is made up of the wind from the firewood drum added by himself. The figure fell slowly. Subai was not as energetic as he had just escaped from death. There was only a look of helplessness on his face. He looked at the monk, then at the fat man, and finally at Lord Buddha. With Subai's character, he couldn't say the words "my life is so bitter" at all, but precisely because he didn't say anything, the helplessness and unwillingness became more intense. Could it be that in my life, I can only be a puppet? Subai slowly sat down. He did not pull out the 3 bronze chains on his body. When his body was repaired and still maintained at the peak of the first level of advanced audience, the bronze chains automatically stopped transmitting energy. Just like before. The fat man was still a little confused. He staggered up to Subai, looked at Subai, and asked. Dabai, what's wrong? Why do you look like your parents are dead? Bah, you should be happy that your parents are dead. What's wrong with you? We survived, you are so awesome, you managed this iron bastard all by yourself. Subai remained silent, as if he didn't hear the fat man's words. The fat man turned back to look at the monk in confusion. The monk came over. He was seriously injured and his breath was weak, but he still said. The side effect of the 2nd level of ancient zombie. In the past, Subai's absorption of the vitality of flowers, trees, and vegetation would cause his head to hurt. But this time, the armored man used almost all the power in his body, including realm, etc. Everything was squeezed out, and after he reabsorbed the power and recovered, he didn't feel any side effects. Then what does this mean? Fatty still didn't understand. He just passed out and didn't see many scenes. The man in armor thought he was a chess piece and a victim, so he went crazy, but maybe. At this point, the monk looked at Subai, who was sitting on the ground in front of him. Wait, let's be clear, what happened to the power in this chain? The fat man was still a little confused. The reason why the man in armor went crazy and attacked Subai was because of his wealth. The reason why Subai became a guardian and practiced the 3rd level of ancient zombie was because of his wealth. I'm afraid, Dabai, the reason why you can activate these 3 iron chains is also because of your wealth, right? The fat man was stunned, and then he cursed loudly, that old gangster wants to seize the body? Is the side effect of the 2nd level of ancient zombies deliberately used here? Subai smiled at this time, as if he had given up resistance completely, and said. This time, everything from the soul to the body and even the realm has been cleansed, so the side effects of this 2nd transformation of the ancient zombie will be infinite. Brothers, I seem to have really fallen into trouble this time. Maybe in the next second, I won't be me anymore. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 951. There's no room for redemption, Fatty asked. Dabai, how can you give up? This is not your style. The fat man had the feeling that the emperor was not in a hurry and the eunuch was in a hurry. It was obviously Subai who was going to be taken away, but in the end he was the calmest. Subai shrugged, looking very relaxed. It's coming, it can't be stopped. I even suspected that when I was first trapped in the place of enlightenment, Su Fugui sent me a little corpse energy every day for me to absorb. In fact, it is to lay the foundation in advance and help me adjust the zombie bloodline in my body to guide me to practice the third transformation of ancient zombies he left behind. Rubbing his chin with his fingers, Subai looked at the anxious fatty and said a little embarrassedly, "It's not that the rabbit is weak, it's that the hunter is too cunning. I was trapped too deep and couldn't get out. The only thing I can do now is to wait for wealth to really come to me and see if I can choose to self-destruct at that time, but I think the possibility of success is low. The whole body, the inside and outside of the soul, and the realm from high to low, were all squeezed out by the armored man. The power that was refilled came from the bronze chains that were deeply connected with wealth. Subai had already gone as far as the strap, and there was no possibility of him getting out. Amitabha the monk clasped his hands together and recited the Buddha's name as if to say goodbye. At this time, the monk switched to a state, because he already knew that this was an impossible situation to solve, and it was even more desperate than when he faced the armored man before. In addition, Subai had already prepared, having chosen it, as a friend, he accepted the outcome. There should be a chance. This bronze chain may not necessarily have something to do with wealth, Buddha said a little strangely. After all, this is something left over 2,000 years ago. No matter how much he, Su Fugui, can arrange it, he can only it's just arranging things after death. No matter what, it's impossible to arrange it until 1,000 years ago. Besides, hasn't Fusu used this bronze chain before? In this world, apart from the remaining remnants of the Qin dynasty generation, there are probably only 4 people who are most knowledgeable about this type of bronze. My cheap parents, then the Yunnan mage and the old rich man. They had really been to Abi hell, where there should be secrets about this kind of bronze vessels, so when Fugui first came here, it was not difficult for Fugui to tease the upright soldier while leaving his own hands and feet on these bronze vessels. Son. Seeing Subai's serious explanation, Buddha suddenly felt a little funny. Although he knew that it was inappropriate to find it funny at this time, he really couldn't help it because Subai was too free and natural now. Can you please stop acting like this? How can this make me prepare for my final farewell? Foy said with a wry smile, and then pointed at the fat man next to him. In terms of acting skills, I can't compare to him. Puff. The fat man laughed, but immediately showed a very sad look. Okay, you guys should go out early. If you still have the strength, help me see if I can seal this place again. Subai said this and then looked at the fat man and the monk who were still seriously injured by overdraft, and then he shook his head and said, "Forget it, I guess the seal here can't trap him. This is really desperate. When you reach this point, you suddenly find that you have no room to fight back. Even when I faced that iron bastard just now, I have never been so desperate." The fat man sat down next to Subai, handed Subai a cigarette, and helped Subai light it diligently. "Dabai, fatty, I will accompany you for the last part of the journey. Don't be too moved." Infected by Subai's emotions, everyone stopped trying to create a sad atmosphere. To be honest, everyone had traveled a lot between life and death, and with the current broadcasting situation, everyone was really going to die. The monk who had not spoken for a while now spoke meaningfully. "Dabai, do you know what's going on? Life and death are determined by fate. Wealth and honor are in heaven." Subai raised his head. The sky above his head was not the sky, but a rich white color. Wealth and honor are in heaven. After saying that, Subai showed a smile, blew out a smoke ring, and said to the monk, "Monk, I really want to eat one more vegetarian meal you made before I die. These days, I'm either eating a small restaurant or eating bobo chicken. Or your vegetarian food is exquisite." "Okay, I'll do it for you," the monk said. "Put 2 more sticks of incense on the table, take a mobile phone and put your photos aside. Let's eat together," the fat man added. "I'm going to die, can't you just laugh at me?" Subai patted the fat man on the shoulder. The sad expression just now was too fake, but now the true colors are revealed. "We have seen through the revolutionary friendship of life and death. You and I are both bricks of the revolution. We can move them wherever needed. Don't worry, I will continue to shine in the world. You must continue to burn the fire of revolution when you go down there." Fatty started the verbal output. "Don't worry, I will talk to the underground ghosts about the love and hate of the black crematorium when I go down, and I will help you warm up the place first." Fatty. Can a person live without a heart? Su Fuegui has been waiting for Yan Huiyang's answer. In this moment, Yan Huiyang's mind was frantically fighting between heaven and man, but the answer was actually very simple. He was not Daji, and he had no reason to be Daji. Even if the person in front of me really comes back from the dead, I can be considered as being kind to him, and there is absolutely no way he can harm me. Moreover, now that the radio is executing the listener destruction plan, there is one more such old antique coming out to add to the lifeless environment. It is also good to bring some variables. Even if the other party doesn't regard him as his savior and fully support him, it is still good as long as he muddies the water and gives himself a chance to fish in troubled waters. Finally, after gathering up some courage, Yan Huiyang, a confused man, replied in a shy voice like a little girl. "Can live." We can't blame Yan Huiyang for suddenly losing his temper. Even if he is a high-level audience, he seems to be walking on thin ice when faced with this situation. Pilo on the side felt so goosebumps when he saw Yan Huiyang's attitude. If he hadn't known that the situation was inconvenient, he would have really couldn't help but run to Yan Huiyang and grab Yan Huiyang's shoulders. Shake it hard and ask him what kind of airplane he is doing. Ha 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 ha. Old Fuegui's almost transparent body kept shaking, and he was laughing, wildly and wildly. Suddenly, a sense of fear began to hit Yan Huiyang's body. He felt that the person in front of him who died more than half a year ago seemed to be really alive. He could really come back from the dead. In the Sumeru space under the water veins of Sanjiang, the 4 people suddenly became quiet. Sudbai's silence was because his whole body was shrouded in a blue light. Sudbai sat still and did not even self-destruct. He seemed it's waiting for the moment when the other person really comes. At the moment, his body has just been thoroughly washed. The power belonging to Su Fuegui is filling his body, building his own realm and reshaping his foundation. This is almost the best state for seizing the body. He has no soul, but Su Fuegui created the 3rd level of ancient zombies. Fusu had been unable to do anything to him before, so would Su Fuegui still be without one? By this time, Subai was too lazy to deceive himself. This was the reason why he was so indifferent before. In a chess game, he had walked into someone else's trap from the beginning. When he realized it, he had no hope of making a comeback. The monk, the fat man and the Buddha took a step back. If nothing else happened, after a while, Subai in front of them would be replaced by another person. The 3 of them are more or less making some calculations in their minds at this moment, thinking about how they will face a new Subai later, and how they will deal with their relationship with this next person. Every audience has their own calculations in their hearts. Especially when you find that you are unable to change anything, everyone will succumb to the established facts. The blue light completely enveloped Subai, even devouring him. For some unknown reason, until the blue light completely dissipated. Subai did not choose to self-destruct, or even attempted to self-destruct. The fat man and the monk looked at each other, and both saw a hint of doubt in Subai's eyes. Did Subai really give up? Or is Subai suffering from Stockholm Syndrome? No matter what the reason was, Subai was really out of character this time. Could it be that he was really tired and gave up? A few moments. The blue light slowly dissipated, and the 3 bronze chains began to hang down and slowly began to dry. At the same time, masses of crystal light began to merge into Subai's body. Immediately, Subai's aura began to grow, breaking through the advanced audience level. Pushing it all the way to the intermediate peak of the advanced audience is equivalent to restoring Subai's original peak strength level. The 3 bronze chains turned into fly ash and piled up at Subai's feet, forming a thick layer. Slowly, Subai opened his eyes. The brilliance in his eyes was restrained, deep and long. The fat man took a tentative step closer, with a bright smile on his face, and said kindly, "Brother Fugui." Seeing Subai didn't respond, the expression on the fat man's face became more friendly and full of flattery as he continued, "Uncle Fugui." "No, Subai, are you okay?" The monk was the first to discover the problem. The person in front of him was still Subai, and he was not taken away. "What?" The fat man didn't even turn around. A gust of wind blew away the thick layer of bronze ash at Subai's feet, revealing 4 crooked words, as if the writer had written them down with laughter. These 4 words are: "Are you scared to pee?" Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 952. My heart is gone, and living is meaningless. Old Fugui seemed to be trying to stand up, but his body, as thin as a cicada, seemed unable to withstand this movement. He did not stand up, like an octogenarian, staggering, and most of his body was no longer in control. He looked down. When I opened the urn, the ashes inside had scattered. It seemed as if his first wife had already taken a step ahead. No, she was waiting for him in front. Old Fugui sighed, as if he was talking to himself, or as if he was specifically speaking to Yan Huiyang. As people get older, they always like to chatter. Alas, his parents are nothing, but who told me that I wanted to be his godfather? My life is miserable. 20 years ago and 20 years later, I fell into trouble because of the same problem. Yan Huiyang didn't know what to say next to him, but he could see that the former giant in front of him had little time. And just now, Yan Huiyang was sure that when he answered "I can live," he was in trouble. It seemed that he sensed a special aura, as if the person in front of him could really come back to life immediately. He was not bluffing, nor was he pretending to be powerful. He could really come back to life, but listening to his words, it sounded like he had given up. But, how is it possible? Tell him for me, what his parents can't give him, I will give it to his godfather. If a person has no heart, he can live, but what's the point of living? It's better to die. As soon as he finished speaking, the old rich man's figure completely disappeared, as if he had followed his deceased wife. And the picture here has completely disappeared at this point. Everything came to an end. There was no sensational hustle and bustle, and there was no brilliance. It was not spectacular, and it seemed that it was not thrilling. He died more than half a year ago. In fact, he really died 6 months ago. He didn't appreciate the previous opportunity at all. He wanted to die, so he died peacefully. People in the world cry and cry just to survive, and when he feels that it is boring, even if the world is full of opportunities for him to survive, he will not care. He is willful. Yan Huiyang squatted on the spot in a daze. He couldn't understand why an audience of that level, would give up the chance of survival. Moreover, before he had time to ask, who was Fugui trying to convey these words to? Whose godfather are you, and who is so lucky to use your inheritance as your godson? At this time, Pilala was finally able to get closer, and he squatted down beside Yan Huiyang, and asked curiously, "What's going on?" "You said, can a person live without a heart?" Yan Huiyang asked, looking at Pilai Tower. "Are you out of your mind?" Piaolu took a deep breath and continued, "I know we are under a lot of pressure now because we are looking for a way to attain enlightenment, but Lao Yan, please don't scare me. If something happens to you, I'm not surprised if you die, but you won't collapse under the pressure, right? That's really inexplicable." In the past, they were also a threesome, plus Lan Lin, but Lan Lin had died in the story world long ago, committing suicide. Because of this, Piaolu seems to be more sensitive to this aspect. He is very worried that Yan Huiyang will follow Lan Lin's old path. "People have no heart," Yan Huiyang pouted, like a child, and stood up slowly. "People have no heart. What does it mean?" Pei Lu watched from the side and did not dare to leave, for fear that something would happen to Yan Huiyang. Yan Huiyang looked at a glass window on the side of the street. From the window, he saw himself, and of course, Piaolu standing next to him. At this time, his brows began to frown more and more, as if thinking, looking at something. I started to fall into a kind of struggle and hesitation. "Pilo, are you afraid of death?" Yan Huiyang suddenly asked again. "Nonsense, of course I'm afraid," Piaolu replied. "But why did Lan Lin commit suicide?" Yan Huiyang asked again. Piaolu was silent for a moment, but still replied, "Because she saw something more terrifying than death." Oh, Yan Huiyang nodded, seemingly non-committal to Piaolu's answer, and then he continued to look at himself in the window. "Are you afraid of death?" This time, Yan Huiyang was not asking about Piaolu, but about himself. He was asking about himself in the mirror. Yan Huiyang's face showed emotions of surprise, hesitation, and uneasiness. All these were naturally shown in the mirror. He seemed to be really stuck in the problems he had given himself, looking a little embarrassed and confused. "I should be afraid too," Yan Huiyang answered himself seriously. "Lao Yan, hello, Lao Yan." Piaolu felt that it would be too late if he didn't wake Yan Huiyang up, because he found that Yan Huiyang's current expression and demeanor were very similar to Lan Lin's. "Then, why is he not afraid of death?" Yan Huiyang asked doubtfully, as if he was thinking about this problem with himself in the mirror at this moment. "How can there be such a person who gives up the hope of resurrection from the dead?" Yan Huiyang squatted down by the mirror again. This was a barber shop. The owner of the shop came out angrily when he saw a guy squatting by the door and window of his house chattering. Pilai opened his hands, and in an instant, the people and objects in the nearby street fell into a slow motion. "Pei Lu, tell me, what criteria does it use to select its audience?" Yan Huiyang asked. "How do I know? I'm not at." Piaolu coaxed Yan Huiyang like a child. "But I know that it only chooses those who are afraid of death. Throughout so many generations at home and abroad, batches of ordinary people have been selected. They are afraid of death, so they struggle in the world of stories and in the circle of listeners. And the stronger they are and the higher their realm, the more they become afraid of death. Maybe they are newborn calves not afraid of tigers, but for whatever reason, under the fear of death, they become the puppets of the broadcast. Usually, they become the playthings of the broadcast for the entertainment of the broadcast. In the end, they will be led on the train and go to another world to serve as cannon fodder. I don't know if anyone has resisted it before, but since I became a listener, I have rarely seen anyone dare to resist it, and they all keep it secret. In the past, I had seen that one, burying love, who smuggled back from that world with a hatred for the broadcast and wanted to seek revenge on the broadcast. The result was a tragic ending. He was pulled into the world of the story by the broadcast, and even his own inheritance was lost. It was stripped out and redistributed as a story world reward by the broadcaster. But he did it out of hatred, because the broadcast, for the sake of fun and his own preferences, forcibly arranged a time for him to let his wife die in front of him. Hate is an emotion that can drive people crazy. In fact, it is also a purpose. When you have hatred, when you have joy, anger, sorrow, and joy, your emotions will control your behavior, which is also reasonable for Yu Zihong. In fact, even if you yawn in vain and boringly, it is actually a purpose. Yan Huiyong kept chattering to himself. The faster he talked, and his eyes even became brighter and brighter as he talked. This kind of bright light made Pilalu on one side look a little frightened. He really didn't know how to deal with it. "Do you still remember what my previous dream was?" Yan Huiyong asked, pointing to himself in the glass. Yan Huiyong thought for a while and answered himself, "A group of brothers can get together and drink together every day." Yan Huiyong stretched out his hand, touched the glass with his fingertips, closed his eyes, and then said slowly, "Life is life, death is death. We, the audience, are the things that life does not bring and death does not take away. No one knows about your existence. Your death will help you erase it. But why bother being urged to jump around like a grasshopper? I still have a heart, or maybe I don't have a heart, but I know that I don't want to die now, and apart from a lot of miscellaneous things, I am living quite comfortably. Therefore, there is nothing to be reluctant to give up and nothing to let go of." Yan Huiyong turned around and faced Pai Lai Tower. The beard on his face trembled, as if he was a little excited. "I will try my best to live and live at all costs." "Well." Piaolu could only nod in response. He couldn't answer no, go to hell. "But if I really die one day, I hope I can be as calm as I am now." "Brother, have you read the Analects of Confucius?" Yan Huiyong asked again. "Have you forgotten that I graduated from the Chinese department? After all, I am also from a scholarly family. You, a gangster from society, want to compete with me in culture? I can still memorize the Analects of Confucius. Okay, let me ask you," Sima Niu said worriedly, "everyone has brothers, but I will perish alone." Pilalu answered directly without thinking. Zixia said, "Shang heard this, life and death have destiny, wealth and honor are in heaven." Before Piaolu could finish memorizing it, Yan Huiyong suddenly raised his head and looked at the sky. "Life and death are destiny, wealth is in heaven." On a plane flying from Chengdu to Qinhuangdao, Boss Liang, who was taking a nap, suddenly opened his eyes with a look of surprise, and unexpectedly said, "So fast." For a moment, Boss Liang suddenly felt lonely. Originally, you were the only one, but now you are not. Naturally, he felt confused and lost. However, Boss Liang still shook his head in a self-deprecating manner, smiled again, and looked out the window. "The plane has arrived in Hebei and should be arriving soon." Pilu looked at his old friend and damaged friend in disbelief, because the scene in front of him was so unbelievable, and it gave him a great shock and excitement. He saw Yan Huiyong's eyes starting to get brighter and brighter. He saw Yan Huiyong's body begin to bloom with a white light. He saw that Yan Huiyong's breath seemed to be boiling like boiling water. He saw Yan Huiyong's head. A huge tombstone appeared. From today on, big boss in the world. No longer the only one. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 953. A plate of mushrooms and green vegetables, a plate of sweet and sour tofu strips, a plate of fried yam with fungus, and a large bowl of white sugar tomatoes and a portion of seaweed and egg drop soup. They are very homely side dishes, but the monk can make every detail of the heat and every bit of the ingredients is perfect, making people feel like their index fingers are moving. Of course, the monk was not a monk who strictly abided by the rules and precepts, so the dishes were not completely vegetarian. At least Subai saw him frying pork belly with oil when cooking. 3 dishes and 1 soup, plus a cold dish and a soup, 4 people sat around a small table. In the yard of Fatty's aunt's house, across the river is the big Buddha. But looking at the big Buddha now, it always gives people a completely different feeling than before. A different feeling, the previous scene seemed like a dream. Logically speaking, sentimentality shouldn't appear in Subai, but this time, something was obviously different. After everyone finished eating, the fat man went to deal with the final part of his aunt's funeral. After all, he still needed to make some arrangements in advance for the first 7 to 5 days and so on. The 2 busiest things for Chinese people are also the 2 things with the most rules. One is giving birth and the other is dying. Fatty wants to give his aunt the last bit of love to make up for the last bit of guilt in his heart. He can only do these things. Of course, he couldn't stay here forever. After all, he didn't have much time. The Buddha is going to visit the Buddha. He is not visiting the Lushan giant Buddha, but exploring the mountains and water potential of Lushan. It has been said that the Lushan area has been the central hub of a great feng shui formation since ancient times. Nowadays, everyone has just come out of that deepest place to feel the nature. More profoundly, Buddha did not understand the formation method, but this did not prevent him from gaining some insights through the pattern of observing mountains and rivers. Of course, the main reason may be that Buddha is too lazy to stay here and listen to the fat man directing the busy work of beating gongs, drums, and singing operas, so he wants to find some peace and quiet. The matter here is settled. After Fatty arranges the funeral, everyone can go back to the orphanage tomorrow. According to Buddha, he plans to build a smaller temple there, which will integrate Tibetan Buddhism and mainland Buddhism. Of course, you can add some of Fatty's Taoist things if you want. Although Lao Fang's family was the fortress and comfort nest in the past, but judging from the current strength of everyone, Lao Fang's defense formation has limited effect. It can only protect against gentlemen but not villains. In the past, when the little guy was kidnapped, the formation didn't have any reaction. The 3 of them didn't care much about whether the small execution ground they built would turn into a tourist attraction or be treated as an idiot in the future. No matter whether they and others were alive or dead in 2 years, they would still leave some memories for the world. Therefore, at this moment, Subai and the monk were the only 2 people still sitting by the river, each holding a cup of chrysanthemum tea. The river is still the same river, and the Buddha is still the same Buddha, but it has lost the artistic conception of sitting here drinking tea and eating melon seeds. After all, Subai just had a fight with this big Buddha not long ago. Now you let him sit here again. It is too unrealistic to appreciate and praise it here with the mentality of an ordinary tourist. The wind blows on the shore, and the river waves are flat. Unfortunately, although there is the dawn wind and the waning moon here, there is no willow bank. Buddha took a sip of tea and said, "Dabai, when you almost lost your body before, you were very calm." "Why do you ask that?" Subai smiled, as if he didn't care very much. In fact, he also knew that the monk was the most thoughtful and profound one among the 4. Even if you showed only a little clue, he would be able to do it. Quickly discover and make guesses. Perhaps, this is just a feeling, a premonition. Subai stretched slightly, but in the final analysis, I was still scared at that time, even desperate. The 2 fell into silence again. In fact, there wasn't much to talk about, and some things couldn't bear to be talked about. For example, when the situation was urgent before, Subai had no time to think about it, but after the matter was over, when thinking about it again, how could Subai not be able to recall what Buddha could see at the beginning? Of course, Subai didn't blame the monk, but the atmosphere of hello, everyone that everyone had managed to create before was somewhat damaged at this time. Let Gyatso do the work of building a dharma ground next to the orphanage. The poor monk will return to Xi'an tomorrow. For a monk, it is urgent to advance, otherwise when something happens again, his strength as a senior person will indeed be somewhat insufficient. Subai nodded, indicating that he understood. The two of them stood by the river and blew in the wind for a while. The monk said that he would go to the Buddha to talk about his thoughts, and then Subai was left alone. Subai found a plastic chair and sat down by the river. He planned to go to Guangxi in a while and visit the place where the old rich man died. It was not possible to say from any emotional point of view. Perhaps because this feeling was too unfamiliar to Subai, and it also made him a little at a loss. The vibration of the phone broke the tranquility at this time. Subai picked up the phone and took a look. It turned out to be Hills. Although the two of them had been colleagues in the proving ground for more than half a year, they actually didn't have much contact after the two of them left the proving ground after the land of proving ground was sealed by the broadcast. Of course, when Subai used the summoning technique before, Hills also supported himself, but Subai didn't go out of his way to call to thank him. It wasn't that Subai didn't even understand this principle of life, he just knew that neither he nor Hills was the kind of person who liked to be polite. The video call was established, and Subai saw Hills on the phone screen. The picture there was a bit grey and gloomy, and the wall behind had mottled traces of time. It was obvious that Hills was not in an ordinary place. "Su, long time no see." Hills' face was still a little pale as before. In fact, his temperament was a bit like Su Yuhang's, the kind that was infiltrated by Chinese classical culture, but his face and bloodline combined with this temperament, it always gives people a deep sense of dissonance. "Long time no see." Subai changed his position on the chair and half leaned down. "Cool, I saw something behind you. Is that the giant Buddha? Wait, let me think about it. By the way, this is the Lishan giant Buddha, right? In Sichuan, China." Subai nodded. This China expert probably has a deeper and more comprehensive understanding of Chinese culture than himself. "My place is pretty cool too. Guess what I found?" Hills moved the phone lens away so that Subai could look around through the lens. Subai saw many severed limbs and various corpses in the picture. This was an ancient battlefield site, and it was definitely not a war with low-strength attributes, because Subai saw several phantoms similar to small mountains in the distance. They were not mountains, but the remains of the giant dragon in the west. Subai had seen the scene in the memory of an ancient vampire. At that time, the battlefield should be in the ancient Egypt area, where the Macedonian army faced various demons that appeared from the black hole in the sky. "Ancient battlefield," Hill said to Subai with a bit of excitement. "Look, is it cool?" "Seriously, Su, this place can give me a feeling of excitement, as if the honor and glory of my ancestors have infected me. After all, more than 2,000 years ago, Western ethnic groups took the lead in fighting the darkness represented by radio. The ancestors were so great. Mr. Hills, please clarify your identity. You are a radio scoundrel. Not long ago, you were a member of the broadcasting business. Your presence there is a serious desecration of those dead souls and that ancient battlefield." Subai didn't mind poking at Hills's good sense of self. "Su, you are still the same. If you continue, you will become cold." Hills sighed. Subai suddenly felt a little pain in his knees. "Aren't you curious about which battle, area, and scale of battlefield ruins this is?" Hills is like a child who has discovered something good and wants to share it with his friends to show off. After all, the two of them are on the path to enlightenment. "I stayed there for more than half a year. At that time, besides you and me, you couldn't find a third person. It was at that time that some habits were formed. I'm even more curious about how you got a signal there and were able to video chat with me. Did you see this?" Hills pointed the camera at a raised solid cone object. "Even if this thing has been used for 2,000 years, the built-in array has not been completely damaged and it can still be used. I think it should be the device used for communication on ancient battlefields is now used by me as a signal booster. By the way, I found a good thing, look at what it is." Hills held up a worn-out piece of armor. It was very simple in shape but had a modern aesthetic style. This armor contains extremely terrifying energy fluctuations. I think it can be used as long as I take it out and repair it. You should have seen the Japanese animation called Saint Seiya. There are similar holy clothes in the WeChat store. I exchanged it, but it was all junk. It was completely incomparable to the one I had in my hand. I can't wait to see how it looks after I repair it. When the time comes, Sue, let's make an appointment. It seems that Hills is still brooding about losing to him at the place of enlightenment. A smile appeared on Subai's lips, and he said, "What a coincidence, I also picked up a holy robe recently. It's fair for me to wear it when the time comes and we can have a good fight, isn't it?" With that said, Subai stood up and walked to the van parked on one side. This was the van that everyone planned to drive back to the orphanage tomorrow. Subai reached out and opened the door, and placed a quilt for the fat man in the third row. The Qin general's armor is covered with talisman paper like a monk. Yes. Subai put the set of armor. Brought out. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 954. A wonderful person like me. I should have lived a glorious life. How come more than 20 years have ended? Still floating in the sea of people. A smart person like me. I have long since bid farewell to simplicity. Why did you still use a relationship? Go and change your scars. The fat man sitting in the passenger seat held a large speaker in his hand and connected it to Bluetooth. At this time, Mao Bai's People Like Me was playing. The fat man's eyes drifted away from the window, slightly deep, as if the song was sung from his own monologue, and he looked like he was totally stinking. You know, this speaker was used by the fat man to play music at the funeral yesterday. He brought it out specially this time to give it to the new temple. Use. Subai was sitting alone in the back seat, with Foye driving the car. The monk had planned his schedule ahead of schedule and got off directly at the Lashan high-speed railway station and planned to take the train to Xi'an. Subai didn't think that the monk was temporarily separated from him to avoid embarrassment. First, he was not a person that he could not ignore. Second, the monk was not a thin-skinned person. Maybe it was just that the monk felt that he needed to be quiet to make some preparations for the next advancement. In short, there were only 3 people left in the car back to the orphanage. Lord Buddha answered a few calls while driving. Normally, he has a kind of arrogant attitude towards his believers and temple staff. But since he wants to build a temple, he naturally needs some people to run around. The monk is here before leaving. He also drew a sketch and kept it, which was regarded as his part of the design plan. After a while, when the new temple is built, maybe the monk will be able to advance and return successfully. The car was driving on the winding mountain road. There was heavy fog and heavy vapor all around, but Subai still opened the car window. Soon, the clothes and the sides of the car window were covered with a layer of moisture. Let's take a rest. Do you want to eat something? Buddha asked. Then let's go and have a rest in front. There is food in the back of the car. Let's have a picnic ourselves, Fatty suggested. In fact, there are restaurants where you can eat in the service areas on both sides of the highway in the mountains and in the villages and towns that the highway passes through. But the stuff there really doesn't taste that good. After Buddha pulled over, the fat man brought some food and drinks out, and the brothers drank a can of beer on the grass beside the cliff. The scenery here is indeed good, but people will get tired of aesthetics after all. After driving all the way here, there are mountains and mountains. After seeing more, I don't think there is anything strange about it. Subai ate some bread and potato chips, while the fat man went to get water from a nearby stream, lit it with talisman paper, boiled it, and made 2 buckets of instant noodles. Subai didn't want any, so he and Buddha each took 1 bucket. To be honest, I just tasted the monk's craftsmanship yesterday, and now it's really hard to eat these. In fact, for Subai and the others, Eating is just a kind of enjoyment, not for living. Therefore, the three of them are actually quite picky about food. The story world is a special environment and there is no way to help it, but in the real world, there is no need for everyone to make do with it. The fat man put down his instant noodles after just one bite, and said helplessly, "Damn, why do you not want to eat it because it smells like plastic?" Fatty started to have a bad temper. Buddha continued to eat leisurely, while Sudbai was non-committal. The fat man rolled his eyes, looked at Sudbai first, leaned against Sudbai with his shoulder, and asked, "Prince, how can you still eat these vulgar foods?" Sudbai smiled and said, "It would be better if you put some blood and give it to me with bread." The fat man ate a little, and then said to Lord Buddha, "Lord Buddha, let's get something else to eat. Anyway, it's not in a hurry to go back to the orphanage, and the journey isn't far. Since we got out of the car and wanted to have a picnic, it's really a picnic." "What can we eat here?" Buddha asked. "Isn't there a goat at the turning just now? Let's go get one and roast a whole lamb." "Fatty, my barbecue skills are pretty good. I'll just find a way to save some money." Sudbai patted him. He boasted about his breasts. Fatty does know how to cook Sichuan cuisine. He used to cook a lot at Lao Fang's house. After all, most delicious people are also good at cooking. But, roasting a whole lamb? What's wrong, you don't believe it? I'm telling you, if it wasn't for the sake of inheriting my father's business, Fatty, I would have thought of becoming a cook. The fat man stood up, walked towards the corner, and ordered, "Pick some, put up firewood." Sudbai and Lord Fo looked at each other and put down what they were holding. But at this moment, a goat suddenly came over on its own initiative. The fat man was stunned for a moment, thinking that a sacrificial warrior had come, but who would have thought that the goat actually passed by the fat man and then slid down the cliff. After wading down, there was a clear stream below. The goat ran to the creek and started vomiting. Yes, vomiting. Sudbai seemed to have never seen a goat vomiting as crazily as a human since he was a child. Moreover, after vomiting for a while, the goat rushed into the river again, and then continued. Vomit. Hey, he's evil. The fat man came back. Is this guy going to become a sperm? It is cleaning itself so that we can eat it more conveniently. Sudbai lit a cigarette, then handed one to the fat man. Then he looked around and saw a little girl's figure appearing on the hill opposite. Wearing simple green clothes, he seemed to be looking at Sudbai from across the cliff. The next moment, Sudbai's figure disappeared from the spot and appeared on the hilltop opposite. The girl turned around and looked at Sudbai. Sudbai felt a very weak evil aura from the other party. "Who are you?" As he said that, Sudbai waved to the fat man opposite him, motioning him to come over and take a look. After all, Sudbai knew that the person in front of him was not a human, but he didn't look like a monster, either. Not zombies. The fat man Yu Jian came over. Although he had always wanted to be as free and easy as Li Xiaoao, Hu Ji was not that bloated. He was elegant and free and easy, but he didn't feel it at all. Instead, it made people feel like a mountain of flesh that had fallen over. The girl turned around and looked at the fat man again. She didn't speak or make a sound, as if she couldn't think. The fat man walked over, put his hand on the top of the girl's head, then focused his gaze, and in an instant he pulled out a silver needle from the back of the girl's head. The silver needle was very long, the length of 2 adult hands. And it had been stuck in the girl's head before. When the silver needle was taken out by the fat man, the smile on the girl's face immediately became more intense, and then her body began to crack, and a bunch of gold and silver ingots made of paper flew out from it. These paper ingots burned on their own after falling to the ground, exuding a foul odor. "What is this?" Sudbai asked again. In fact, the girl's threat was not threatening at all. After all, the three of them were no longer the wuxia men of the past. Unless they encountered perverts like Armor or Fusu who were related to the pre-Qin dynasty, there were few who could threaten their safety. Yes, of course, threats within the audience circle do not count. The little girl who was buried with her turned into a spirit and ran out on her own. She wanted to ask us for help to find relief. She brought that goat as a reward for us, the fat man said calmly. Haha, that goat, the goat has vomited out its intestines. I'm going to clean up and start the barbecue early. Subai lowered his head again and looked at the paper ashes on the ground. He finished smoking the cigarette quietly and returned to the fat man. The fat man used Buddha's hatchet to remove the bones and scrape the flesh. When Subai came back, the two of them were someone has already lit a fire and set up a simple grill. Then I'll just wait and eat. Subai had nothing to do to help, and it seemed that he was of no use. He sat down next to him and said, the suppression of the broadcast is getting weaker and weaker. The appearance of Fusu and the riot of the armored men were a big aspect, but now the three of them actually met a girl running out of who knows which tomb on the road. This was a small aspect. In short, it seems that when the broadcast is about to move, those things that are usually invisible seem to have lost their restraints. This is different from what I and others expected before. Everyone thought that the broadcast would be cleaned, but now the snakes, rats and ants have all crawled stately in the living room. Perhaps, radio has already changed the dimensional properties of this world. Maybe radio is deliberately suppressing some things so that this world can still retain some things that should not appear and exist in a technologically civilized society. Buddha guessed, after all, broadcast also knows that when the water is clear, there will be no fish, but I think that maybe after broadcast leaves here and enters the next world plane, the plane attributes of this world will clean up themselves. Of course, the level of this kind of cleaning will be relatively low, just like washing a piece of clothing with clean water, which can remove most of the dirt, but stubborn stains still need to be solved by the listener before leaving the broadcast. There is no need for us to take action at this level. Since the girls buried with them can be transformed into spirits, obviously the owner of the tomb should be more powerful, but at most a senior person can solve it, and the broadcaster will not assign us a real task to do this. Yes, this is overkill. After the fat man finished speaking, he smashed his mouth and said somewhat helplessly, I only have salt here, but no other seasonings. Let's just eat together. At least it tastes better than instant noodles. Although there was firewood in the fire, the fat man added a igniting charm, so the fire burned like a small stove. Soon, the fat man began to cut the meat. Each person took a big piece, and sat on the ground, and everyone began to eat. Subai tore off a piece and put it into his mouth. The mutton was charred on the outside and tender on the inside, with just the right hint of mutton flavor. Hey, I just like to eat something with a bit of odor, otherwise what's the difference between eating pork? The fat man smiled, obviously quite satisfied with his craftsmanship. Subai took a few more bites, then put the mutton down and said, that's not right. What's wrong? It doesn't taste good, the fat man asked. We went to Lishan, but Fusu who was sealed in Lishan came out, and the armored man who was sealed under Sanjiang also started to be restless and almost came out. If this is explained by coincidence, it is barely possible, but in an inexplicable tomb the girls who have become sperm and buried with them can take the initiative to come to us to seek relief. I thought it was strange before, because with our current strength level, the buried girl would not be able to sense our special aura even if she became a spirit. Based on her strength level, she should think that we are just ordinary people. Subai paused again, and then a look of understanding appeared on his face. I understand, Lord Buddha, your guess is probably wrong. I think the cleaning method of the radio is very simple. We should have had this feeling when we first became listeners. It seems that those supernatural and strange things will happen around me or be encountered by me with increasing frequency. So now, the radio should have turned up this frequency. Now all listeners in the real world are like big light bulbs in the dark night to things that do not conform to the theme of the medium-level technological civilization plane. Where are the listeners nearby? Those things will come one after another regardless of their strength. Even if it's a moth flying into a flame. We are actually doing okay, and even experienced people can be considered okay, but experiencers, low-level listeners, and ordinary listeners may have started a while ago, and the real world may be more dangerous to them than the story world.